Hi everyone, this is Becca Hunt from the Children's Safety Network. Welcome to today's webinar, Connections Between Bullying and Other Types of Violence, Family Violence, Sexual Harassment, and Dating Violence. This is the first in a series of webinars on bullying, awareness, response, and prevention that CSN will be hosting. The series is based on the Building Capacity to Reduce Bullying and its Impact on Youth Across the Lifecourse workshop, which was convened by the Institute of Medicine and the National Research Council in April of 2014. This series is produced in conjunction with HRSA, the Health Resources and Services Administration, and also features a series of blogs that will appear on the stopbullying.gov website. We'll provide a link to that resource on the left-hand side of the screen. To get us started, I'd like to pass things over to my colleague Rebecca Wilmer to talk to us about today's technology.
Thanks, Becca. So there are two options to hear today's audio. You can listen through your computer speakers or call into our phone line at 866-835-7973. If you're using your phone, please mute your computer speakers to eliminate any echo. Phone lines will be muted during this presentation to eliminate background noise. If you have any questions or technical issues, you can type those into that Q&A box over on the lower left-hand side of the screen. You can submit your questions and comments at any time during the presentation in that Q&A box. After the presentation, we're going to pause for the presenter to answer your questions. We'll have two polls during this webinar, and they'll appear over on the left-hand side of the screen when they're ready. This webinar will be recorded and archived and sent out to all registrants after the session.
Thank you, Rebecca. Now I'd like to present our presenter. Dr. Dorothy Espelage is an Edward William Gutskull and Jane Marr Gutskull Endowed Professor and Hardy Scholar of Education in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She has conducted research on bullying, homophobic teasing, sexual harassment, and dating violence for the last 22 years. She's an author on over 130 peer-reviewed journal articles, 25 chapters, and has co-edited 5 books. She is an associate editor of the Journal of Counseling Psychology, and her research focuses on translating empirical findings into prevention and intervention programming and informs national policy. She conducted large-scale randomized clinical trials to evaluate social and emotional learning prevention programs in elementary and middle schools to reduce bullying and aggression. She is funded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the National Institute of Justice, and the National Science Foundation. She authored a 2011 White House brief on bullying among LGBTQ youth and attended the White House Conference in 2011. With that, I'd like to pass it over to Dorothy.
Great. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited to spend the next 45 to 50 minutes talking through some very exciting findings that we have from a large-scale longitudinal study with the goals of really getting all of us to think about the interconnections between family violence, bullying, sexual harassment, and teen dating violence from early to late adolescence. And so I will try, what I'm first going to do is to walk us through kind of the model that we proposed and found support for across a 5.5-year study from early adolescence to late adolescence. But before I do that, I would like to make it clear that I'm going to present 7 waves of data where we tracked kids from early adolescence to late adolescence, and the first 5 waves of those data were supported by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And then National Institute of Justice was nice enough to understand the importance of us continuing to kind of look at how family violence predicted bullying, and then funded waves 6 and 7 for us to see the connections to sexual harassment and teen dating violence. And so I just want to make sure that we know that. I would also like to thank my colleagues at the University of Illinois and Arizona State University who have been critical in ways in which thinking about these interconnections. So I thought what we do is just kind of kick off with a question, and you'll get to see the Q&A box to the left there. But true or false, generally, do you think it's true that bullying during middle school has been identified as a precursor to sexual harassment or teen dating violence? And clearly, I'll give you just a few minutes to click on the button for true or false, or if you don't want to vote, or you think that it's a little more complex than true or false, that's okay too. If you think the jury's still out, you're probably a good social scientist. And so, yeah, so many of you, and the numbers are kind of growing steadily here, do believe that this is a precursor. We should know that we haven't always thought this. And the research base is really just now growing. And as I talk you through our model that we tested, hopefully if we were to ask this question again at the end of the webinar, you would say most certainly it probably is a precursor. And so that would be a nice pre-post test there. Okay, so what I'd like to do, because this is 7 waves of data and it could be really complex with lots of variables, I want you to keep this conceptual model in mind, and then we'll present the empirical data. But for many years, I was trying to get the field, both researchers and practitioners, to understand that we're only focusing on bullying prevention, and we're not understanding the precursors or kind of the consequences of that we're going to continue to have challenges in moving the needle of bullying. And we really needed to understand the basic research around what predicts bullying involvement in adolescents and how bullying involvement and perpetration sets the stage for more nuanced forms of aggression. So here, what we're going to do is, the kids are in 5th and 6th grade, right? And so we did an assessment of child abuse and domestic violence. We also assessed for family conflict and sibling aggression. And then, so that's the family context, early adolescence. As they go through middle school, we do know that anger and drug and alcohol use and delinquency is associated with bullying perpetration. But then we really wanted to test the extent to which bullying perpetration then predicted both sexual harassment in later middle school, but ultimately in high school, and then we added the teen dating violence perpetration. For some of you who have been in the field for a really long time, you would see that this kind of looks like almost a Malamuth confluence model, right? So we have different ways of thinking about how the family context could then contribute to the peer context, right, with the bullying piece. And then as the aggression becomes much more genderized and nuanced, we would predict this into high school. So keep that in mind, because it might be overwhelming, but I have tried to make it somewhat streamlined so that we come up with conclusions and implications that stem from this conceptual model. So what I want to do now is to walk you through each piece of this model and where the support is in the literature. And in some cases, it's a dearth of literature, but we'll speak to that as well. So when we think about this current study, really bullying is viewed as a form of peer and social interaction that is influenced, maintained, and really mitigated by the relationships in schools, peers, and the family context. And Deb Pepler talked quite a bit about this even, almost 10 years ago. However, despite this recognition of the overlap and it's important of the social interactions, few studies have investigated the family context of bullying perpetration. And regrettably, so many of these studies are cross-sectional. And we know that, that's not just a researcher saying this, but we know when you put a longitudinal frame onto these phenomena that the pathways are different and they change. So it's important to look at these longitudinally. So this research is really predicated on a social ecological model, but also pulls in social interactional learning model in which family violence serves as the important context for understanding the relationship between bullying, involvement in anger, delinquency, and then later sexual harassment and teen dating violence perpetration. You should know that we're focusing on perpetration here just because ultimately the teen dating violence outcomes in high school of perpetration and victimization are highly correlated. And I know that someone might ask questions about that, but just for now we're focusing on perpetration. So let's think about that kind of the left side of the equation associated with bullying. We certainly do know that coercive exchanges between parents and their children in the home often co-occur with abuse and conflictive family dynamics, which are then linked to bullying. Again, there's this is a body of literature that's growing, but several cross-sectional studies and longitudinal studies where they're able to assess this information and studies have found that direct and indirect exposure to family violence has been linked in some studies to bullying behavior. We also know in our own work, using some of the sample presented here, that left side of the equation we had the support for. strong evidence linked family conflict and sibling aggression to bullying perpetration. So we had evidence there. We just wanted to see the extent to which this then predicts later types of violence. Now, the piece that really is the tricky connection is the connection between bullying and peer victimization and sexual violence. And then as you imagine, it's very difficult to go in and do these studies in schools and ask kids about sexual harassment, because most of parents out there really think that middle school is too early to talk about sexual harassment. They also think that it's problematic. We're going to introduce some ideas to them. So that's why I think you see very few studies with the bullying, the sexual harassment, sexual violence link. But there is a Brazilian study in 2005 that showed the connection between bullying and sexual harassment in high school students, which is not surprising. Deb Pepler in Canada found a connection between bullying victimization and sexual harassment victimization. Pellegrini did an observational study in a Minnesota middle school and did in fact find in a short-term longitudinal study that there was an association. Those kids that engaged in high rates of bullying were more likely to also then, over a year period, sexually harass their peers. And so that's strong because it's observational. We also know that sexual harassment in middle school is largely homophobic in nature, or the use of homophobic epithets, right? And so there's a growing body of literature after 2000 that shows a large percentage of bullying involved homophobic slurs, which is, again, that kind of connection, because sexual harassment in middle school really is unwanted commentary and homophobic bantering. And then in this own sample, we found support for that part of the model as well, that bullying perpetration predicted sexual harassment perpetration in the first 2.5 years. So we were building that model as we were collecting data, and certainly it was showing up to be quite robust. Now, it's also important to understand in that model that, violence and delinquency has also been shown to be related to teen dating violence. So violence against peers has been correlated with using sexual and physical violence against dates. Early antisocial behavior, including alcohol and drug use and aggression, has been shown to predict later use of violence against dating partners. And that's not a surprise to anybody on this webinar that there's a connection between alcohol and drug use and teen dating violence. They go hand in hand often. And a 2001 study showed aggression perpetrated with young adolescent boys was associated with dating violence perpetration at the age of 16 and 17, which really provides support for that right side of the equation, the right side of the conceptual model, if you will. Also, just to demonstrate, there's very few studies that have included both bullying, sexual violence, and teen dating violence. Everyone on the webinar should know, though, that there's an increasing body of literature that's out there that's showing the same connection. I was just at a conference, and the entire symposium was on the connection between family violence and bullying, sexual violence, and teen dating violence. And one study was 20 years long, from infancy and to teen dating violence, and every one of the papers found this connection. So this is real, and we need to pay attention to it. So there's certainly this connection between bullying and sexual violence. And then Miller and her colleagues did a really nice paper on latent class analysis and showed how sexual harassment and bullying and teen dating violence are interrelated in middle school kids, which was fascinating. So I encourage you. And we can provide a number of these papers if you would like. Now, what about this family piece, right? So we know that there's a connection in a few studies from family to bullying, but what about family predictors of teen dating violence? Now, largely these studies have either been Banji-Foshi's intervention studies, or people have mined national data sets, or they've mined, the ad health data. So what do we find? And I'm not going to summarize completely, but just to give you a glimpse, into the window of what are the family predictors. So perceived laxness or low parental monitoring and harsh parenting at age 10 to 12 years and antisocial behavior at age 15 were associated with greater psychological and physical dating violence. And one of those papers at SRC actually showed harsh parenting to predict over 7 years to adolescent teen dating violence. So that construct of harsh parenting is coming around again. These findings are completely consistent with previous studies of Banji-Foshi and Matthew, where they review parental supervision, predicted dating abuse perpetration. However, it's not a direct effect, right? And we need to start thinking, and even the conceptual model that I presented to you, we're now unpacking some of those connections. This is kind of our first big conceptual model, but we have to think about mediators, right? So we have to think about where there's exposure to marital violence, right? In this particular study, results indicated that adolescents exposed to marital violence during childhood were more likely to justify the use of violence. And what we do know about our teen dating violence prevention programs is where they really do some good work is minimizing the justification of aggression. It may not often change the behavior, but that potential mediator is important. But more recent studies have also reported an intersection between interparental violence and acceptability of dating violence. And even in the sample I'm talking about here, which I won't, but I'll allude to this, 20 to 25% of the high school students felt justified under some circumstance, whether it's cheating or jealousy, flirting with someone else, of using aggression against a dating partner. So this is alive and well in high school students in justifying this. But it seems to have, it stems from seeing this type of behavior in the home. Other studies of male participants, which are largely studied in the connection between family and intimate partner violence, identify mediators of that transmission, the relationship context of violence. So one example is emotion dysregulation and poor parenting skills at young ages were key mediators in predicting relationship conflict among 190 men and their mothers and fathers across 21 years. So when you start talking about these associations holding across decades, those are the points of intervention that we really need to think about. So within the context of this study, our indicator of emotion dysregulation is really anger. Anger is quite a robust predictor of both sexual harassment, bullying, and teen dating violence. So we wanted to see the extent to which it explains some of the connections across the study. So I know there's a lot of literature, but you can thank me for that I summarized it in such a succinct way. So the rationale really is that many comprehensive and social contextual theories remain untested, given the dearth of longitudinal studies that have focused specifically on kind of precursors to teen dating violence. Despite the overlap in continuity and violence across contexts and lifespans, few of these have examined peer linkages, including delinquency, alcohol and drug use, peer delinquency. So between these family characteristics and teen dating violence, we proposed that delinquency and anger as a potential mediator, which is good because you can target anger, right? We can address anger in our prevention programs and hopefully stop that link. Remember, that's what a mediator is. If we're able to intervene at that mediator, we hope that we can at least minimize that connection between family violence and other forms of violence. And to be honest, many of the studies that are out there on looking at supposedly epidemiological kinds of associations really have been part of intervention in efficacy studies. And it makes a lot of sense that we would mine that data, but it does really give us a limited ecological data, and it might limit the types of data collected as well because you're collecting based on an intervention logic model, not necessarily a public health epidemiological model. So what did we do here? In a longitudinal studies across 5.5 years, we tested an ecologically driven model that incorporates the influence of peers, parents, and family factors. We evaluated the extent to which there's changes in these key socializing agents across middle school through high school. And we attempted to, and it's not a complete comprehensive model, but we attempted to look at the extent to which there's antecedent correlates of bullying, sexual harassment, and teen dating violence perpetration. So to remind you now, I would walk through each one of these circles in the conceptual model. We really did propose that some of these family dynamics like child abuse, domestic violence, physical abuse, family conflict, and civil aggression would be associated with higher rates of anger, delinquency, drug abuse, which would be associated with bullying perpetration over the middle school years. But drawing again upon that literature, we suspected that as these kids matured into high school, that sexual harassment perpetration would then emerge, and then teen dating violence perpetration as well. And so this is a kind of a path analysis. So once we have all the variables in, if there's a connection to, say, bullying to sexual harassment perpetration, that is controlling for all of the families. So we're testing this exact model. Okay, so who are these kiddos? We are very, very fortunate to have a school district that let us come in and ask the questions in this model that many school districts would not. I was also fortunate to have an institutional review board that was invested in the science in this and the importance of preventing teen dating violence over time. So we were able to track across the years 1,162 students. Now what you're going to see is that the model I'm presenting to you today is going to include only those kids that have dated in high school. So it's about 625 kids out of that 1,162 students. So a lot of the research that I showed you what that was a 2.5-year study included 1,162. Here we're including just daters, right? So we want to make sure that we have just the daters in there. There are 3 cohorts. At wave 1, remember again, there's 7 waves of data across 5.5 years. At wave 1, they're about 12 years old. We have to keep that in mind that we're talking about, really middle school kids. Racially diverse as far as 51% identified as Black or African American and 26% as white, and the other numbers really were multiracial. We're talking about a sample that's 60% free and reduced lunch, and a real at-risk community as well. And there's 7 waves of data collection, all self-report, although we did do some fabulous focus groups after both of these studies, and those qualitative analyses have been written up and really do inform some of the work that we do. And again, those papers can be provided to the participants after the webinar as well. So as opposed to sitting here and talking to you about alphas and construct validity and the items, I have a couple slides on measures, but I want to make sure that we have time for questions. And so you should know that these are psychometrically sound scales. Many of them have been used in other studies. So Thornberry's family conflict, which is in hostility scale, has been used for decades. Psychometrically strong. You should know that these measures are very, very strong in our studies. Sibling aggression, we used Renee Duncan's work for this idea of both verbal and physical aggression, but it's not, in this particular study, you have to remember, it is really this idea that I have been injured by a sibling, or I fear that I might be injured by a sibling. So we're not talking about, arguing over the tablet that they want to play. We're really talking about some serious injury. We were allowed by the institutional review board to ask the kids in the first few waves of the study, before the age of 9, did a caregiver or parent hit you, slap you? So that was a physical item. Before the age of 9, did a caregiver sexually touch you when you didn't want to be touched sexually? And then the extent to which one item they saw their caregivers or their parents in their house hit one another. And that's important to know because you're going to see that these fell out of the model, and I think they fell out of the model because they're single item indicators, not such strong psychometrics. Okay. Now, when we think about individual factors, we asked them in the last 30 days about different types of ways of reacting through anger, the extent to which they engaged in self-reported delinquency, the extent to which they used alcohol, drugs, or cigarettes. For the peer factors, we looked at the extent to which their peers engaged in some of the same types of self-reported delinquencies, right? So we know that that co-occurs. For bullying perpetration, we used the University of Illinois Espelage measure that was really non-verbal, non-physical. It's highly verbal, some rumor spreading, social relational aggression, which is pretty common within the context of middle school. And for sexual harassment, we used a modified version. We've been modifying the AUW measure for a number of years because it really is a little bit outdated. So when we do focus groups, kids will talk about other types of sexual harassment that they're experiencing that's not reflected in the AUW. And so this functioned very well for us, but this is largely, you should know, in the middle school years. Unwanted sexual commentary, unwanted rumor spreading, and a lot of homophobic language. Very small percentage of kids, about 2 to 3%, are saying that they have had their private parts touched by a peer when they didn't want that to happen, or they directed that towards someone. So it's a very small number. I mean, anything greater than 0 is a problem. but you should know that when we're looking at the models, we're talking about this unwanted sexual commentary and rumor spreading and homophobic language. Okay. We use the CADRE, which is a conflict and adolescent dating relationships inventory, to measure dating violence perpetration. And as you can see, so this is important because dating changes, but the context of dating has changed, and we need to continue to understand how adolescents define it. But we incorporate a lot of Nan Stein and Bruce Taylor's way of asking these questions. So by dating, we mean spending time with someone you're seeing or going out with. Examples of this might include hanging at the mall, the neighborhood, or home, or going somewhere like the movies, a game, or a party. It doesn't have to be a formal date or something you planned in advance, and maybe with a small group. The term date includes both one-time dates and time together as part of long-term relationships. And many of our kids, so this sample that I'm presenting to you, 625 kids had dated that we were able to track over the 5.5-year period. And you should know that even if you look just at our high school data, 80% of the kids have dated at least, they've been at least on one date. Right? So this is a phenomenon that's real, and most of the dating, it started in middle school, especially with the definition that we provided. So on the CADRE, there's those verbal types of calling names and putting one another down, and there's physical. There's also relational, meaning that they would track their passwords or kind of control their social group, if you will. And then there's also sexual coercion within the dating relationship as well, which is going to be important as we look at this data. Now, it's always helpful to get some sense of, okay, what are these kids doing in high school and what have they experienced in their lifetime around teen dating violence? And so I've pulled out, just because it's nice to have a descriptive, I just pulled out some things that were most common. So when we look in the verbal, 31% did something to make their partner angry. 26% used a hostile tone with their partner. 29% kept track of their partner's activities. When we look at physical, 10% slapped or hit their partner, and 11% bit their partner, which was fascinating because we present these results back to the administration and the teachers in the high schools. And I remember one of the high schools, a teacher said, yeah, we've heard quite a bit about biting within relationships, kind of violent relationships. So that was not a surprise to them. 6% forced their partner to kiss him or her. So these are kind of our numbers that we're dealing with. Certainly it's happening. Now, I want to speak to the gender differences. And I don't want to say too much about this except to say that these numbers are very similar to other studies, high school studies. But I also want to say that we did not measure fear or injury in this study. Institutional Review Board was going to have us kind of mandate report on that, so we were not able to. I think so you have to, and we know the literature, I mean, you have to look at fear and injury, and that's where you see kind of gender differences. But I do want to point out the difference in sexual teen dating violence perpetration, that males are reporting a little bit more than the females. But you do see that females verbally are saying that they perpetrate this more than boys, and physical teen dating violence as well. Just to show that this is somewhat consistent with some labs out there, but to also argue that this may not be, self-report may not be the best way to get the full picture. You should also know that perpetration and victimization are correlated 0.7. And so that's pretty high, so it suggests that there's definitely some dyadic interchange here. But 0.7, if you square that, it's 50% overlap, right? So it's not 100%. And so we're trying to unpack some of these data, which we're not going to do in the next 15 minutes. But so what do we do here? Now, this is what I'm so excited about. When you have a study and you can retain some kids and you get to ask these questions across the 5.5 years, and I wanted to just say I told you so, because we're going to find great support for this model. So remembering that the kids are in middle school waves 1 through 5, they then transfer to high schools in waves 6 and 7. 6 and 7, because they're a year apart, and if you know the teen dating violence literature, you know that these patterns of interacting and dating are already established before high school. So it's highly correlated. So we don't have, as Jeff Temple will say, we don't really have new violent relationships emerging within high school. It tends to have already been established. And we found that those kids that were engaging in high rates of teen dating violence at wave 6 were doing that at wave 7. So it was pretty darn stable, so we combined that. And then we fit models, we imputed data, so we ended up having 30 imputed data sets. And then we ran these separately for boys and girls, just given, although there may, in some places there may not be prevalence differences, we know that there are different correlates based on gender. So that's what we're going to present to you today. So this table for the statisticians that are participating on this webinar, and for those of you that are not statisticians like me, you want to look at the fit statistic of the root mean square error of approximation, which is RMCEA. And you want that to be close to 0. And anything under 0.5 or 0.05 or 0.07 is considered a good fit. This is a very strong fit, and the other residuals you'll see are very close to 0 as well. So remember the conceptual model? I'm now going to flip to, and like I'm revealing the curtain here, you'll see, I'm going to walk you through this. I'm going to try this little thing here. Now, that's not really working. Maybe I won't. Hold on. I got it. Okay. So if everyone can kind of go from the left to the right, what you're going to see is we have bullying through the middle. So bullying perpetration, wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, wave 4, 6, 7, which is high school sexual harassment, and then sexual teen dating violence. If you go to the top of bullying wave 1, you can see when we control for bullying wave 1, family conflict, if I'm in a home that has a lot of conflict and I'm a girl, I'm more likely to bully at school. If I have reported that there's a lot of aggression between myself and my siblings, which if anyone knows me, I think that's a proxy for family violence, that predicts bullying over time. As you move to the right, you'll see that sibling aggression continues to predict over time through middle school all the way to high school, right? If we're not addressing kind of that sibling aggression, we may not break some of this cycle. Family conflict seems to drop out, and I think in large part that could be due to kids just getting older, and if there's a conflict in the home, they just leave the home, but it seems that sibling aggression is still there. Bullying is pretty darn stable throughout this process, but what you'll also see when you go down, so go all the way to the left of the model, and you'll see that delinquency in friends and high rates of anger predict bullying. And that continues to happen all the way through high school, right? Now, the big thing that we see here is that bullying, controlling for everything that I did since I was in the 5th and 6th grade, bullying is associated with sexual harassment, which is then associated with sexual teen dating violence. And we see that anger at the bottom is associated with verbal teen dating violence, which is then associated with physical teen dating violence, which is then associated with sexual teen dating violence. So here we have a model in which family conflict, sibling aggression predicts the onset and the continuation and stability of bullying perpetration. Bullying perpetration predicts the sexual harassment, which then is associated with sexual teen dating violence. And anger is still driving teen dating violence, which is verbal, that then is associated with physical. And you also see that cigarette and alcohol use also predicted in the high school years. So as we continue to think about teen dating violence prevention, there has to be a discussion around alcohol and drug use and how that kind of intersects with sexual harassment that then predicts sexual teen dating violence. Okay, hopefully you guys are okay and you're so excited that this model fit, and there's so many points of intervention, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. Now for the boys model, we see that the fit is very, very strong. Remember, root mean square of error approximation. It's very nice. And again, to impress upon you, this is reality, because these models are very difficult to fit, especially across 5.5 years. So this means that we really do have some good points of intervention here. Now, I'm not going to go into tremendous detail because it looks very, very similar if you were paying attention. But, and so it looks very similar. So we have a very similar, some of the coefficients are a little bit different, but sibling aggression is very important, family conflict's important. Where we do see the difference is that here, well, we don't see much difference actually. So we have sibling aggression still showing up for boys across the years, and we have bullying predicting sexual harassment to sexual teen dating violence, which is associated with physical. We have the bullying that's associated with anger, that's associated with verbal, that escalates to physical, right? And I want it to escalate because that's kind of cross-sectional within the model, but it's definitely associated, right? Okay, thank you for the assistance with the cursor. Okay, so so what do we know? So the exposure to family trauma, as you notice, those single item indicators drop out of the model. And I don't want to say that they're not important. I think it's just psychometrically we need to figure out how that we can get this data in such a way that we can continue to do these studies. The final model for the boys and girls were beautiful. I would say even better than good. And so for boys and girls, sibling aggression, bullying others, and anger at previous waves significantly predicted bullying during the middle school years. And for boys, bullying and sibling aggression were predictive of bullying perpetration. Family conflict was not as strong. So it was in there in wave one, and although it dropped out for the girls too, family conflict, if we look deep into the coefficients, was not as strong for the boys. And if you know anything about boys, when there are family conflict, boys tend to just leave the home. Girls tend to be in the home more. But for all youth, delinquency, alcohol and drug use, and bullying predicted sexual harassment and teen dating violence into high school after controlling for all of that kind of individual propensity over time. Okay, so we have another poll question. True or false? Teen dating violence prevention programs should start to be implemented in high school and not any earlier. Yes, that is so true. It is a challenge, however, to get schools to recognize that these types of, programs need to happen prior to high school. I mean, there's a huge pushback there. And as we're finding increasingly that these patterns of reacting and conflict styles are already kind of established by high school, we must start having these conversations before. It's intriguing that there's about 9% that are saying, no, high school is where it's at. And that's most of what the field is saying. It's really challenging if we're going to do school-based work, which is really challenging, to convince, parents, administrators, teachers, that these conversations need to happen. I would argue K through 12, right? Let's get them in the elementary school years to think about how they interact, not necessarily dating, but just generally healthy relationships. Okay. So these are, and we can send you the full paper on this where I have lots of recommendations that were written out for the National Institute Justice final report, which you can also find on the web, and very specifics. But generally what I argue in that final report is that we have to, if in fact bullying is a precursor to some of these more nuanced violence, forms of violence, we need to incorporate discussions of gender-based name-calling, sexual violence, and gender expression. And we're doing some of this work, and I have to tell you, we're doing this in a gender-enhanced social emotional learning program with middle school teachers, and they love it. Like, they just want to know how to, get in there and talk to kids about the language that they're using that's marginalizing girls and denigrating girls. They simply do not have the skills, and they're open to this. It's been great doing this gender-enhanced social emotional learning randomized clinical trial. We also have to think, how do we interrupt this intergenerational transmission of violence from families to peers? How do we do this? I think in so much of our work, we get frustrated because parents don't show up, or there's low response rate in family interventions. And it's difficult to move that, but how can we be more creative about addressing that? If it's not directly the family violence that they're witnessing, just because some people get very uncomfortable with that, how do we talk to them about the attitudes that justify aggression under some circumstance? And when I say that there's 20 to 30 of these high school kids in the sample that say, yeah, it's okay for a boyfriend to hit his girlfriend if she flirted with someone else. That's a problem. We need to intervene. We need to understand where that's coming from. And even 22 years ago when I started doing bullying prevention work, in our models that we ran, anger predicted bullying over and above other things. So emotion dysregulation and anger, especially when you don't have the conflict resolution skills, you might have a real conflictual style. I think the anger itself is only going to escalate, especially if we introduce alcohol and drug use into high school. So I think anger management, and that should be for everybody, anger management should happen. But there's implications for research, right? I mean, I think that research must consider multiple contexts, the family context, the peer context, to identify the mediators and moderators that are malleable. Which ones can we target? Which ones are the most developmentally appropriate? Which ones, what's the developmental timing of these things? Evaluation studies need to assess and address multiple forms of teen dating violence, perpetration, and victimization. And one other thing is, I always give a shout out to Sherry Hamby, who wrote a beautiful monograph with John Gresh last year, really calling to the field for us to break down our silos. That, you know, we need, the bully researchers need to talk to the sexual harassment researchers, we need to talk to the family aggression researchers. You've got to break this down, right? So it's not just discipline silos, it's the form of aggression that I study or the form of the violence. The reality is all connected, and they all share risk and protective factors. Yes, there may be unique ones for some of those forms, but we certainly need to think about breaking down those silos. And then finally, I think one thing that we want to kind of look into is really increasing the research attention to sexual coercion in dating relationships, especially for the girls in this sample. Okay. My goodness. That was so much fun. I hope that was fun for you guys. Okay, I'm a few minutes early. Something? Great.
No, I think that's perfect. We've got about 20 minutes for questions and answers, and there's lots of questions coming in, so I think that we'll have lots of opportunity to suss out this conversation a little bit more. That was really a phenomenal presentation. Thank you very much. So for the participants in the room, there are a few resources on the screen in front of you and off to the left-hand side in the links pod, including the IOM workshop presentation where you can learn a lot more about bullying and bullying prevention, the stopbullying.gov website, and the CSN Bullying Prevention Resource Guide. So Dorothy, if you don't mind, I'd like to launch into asking you some questions from the audience members.
That'd be great.
All right, the first one is around controls. We've gotten a few questions that are asking about the populations that you worked with. There was an observation that the ethnicity and race of the group tend to focus a little bit more on African American students. Did you have additional ethnicities involved, or is there any way, is there any specific studies that can be done to incorporate other ethnicities as well?
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's a great question, and this study just happened to be done in a school district in which those are the demographics. Currently, we're doing a high school study in which it includes teen dating violence measures, where it's a fourth, and fourth. So it's a fourth African American, a fourth Hispanic, a fourth multiracial, and a fourth Caucasian. So we'll be able to answer some of those questions with that. There's really a dearth of literature. I mean, you can look at some of the national data sets where they look at ethnicity. Those studies, which my study could be criticized for this too, have been criticized for the way in which they have collected that information around race and ethnicity, oftentimes only looking at race or only looking at ethnicity and not the combination. And I don't want to speak too much about those studies because they often use single item indicators. The race and ethnicity is a combination, and I think they perpetuate stereotypes about some ethnic minority, that may become the majority. So I think we need to do a better job of measuring that. And, the bottom line is we go into school districts that let us come in. But we're hopeful that our high school studies now that are much more kind of representative of the U.S. population will give us some more information on that. But yeah, it's definitely a limitation. And now you started the question with control, though.
Right. Well, there's another question in here as well around socioeconomic status. So a couple of the participants pointed out that 60% of the participants in the research received lunch. So they're making an extrapolation that this might mean that they're part of a lower socioeconomic status. And they wonder if there's any research that should be done that controls for socioeconomic status, or if there's anything that should be done with middle class or upper, more wealthy populations.
Yeah, a great point. Now, Vanjie Foshi has a paper that we can track down where she looked at SES and found exactly what you were saying, that there was higher rates of teen dating violence within, I think one of her papers, she didn't find that it predicted anything, and in other papers it was lower SES. But we certainly do know that domestic violence, intimate partner violence can happen across all of SES. Again, it comes to, we want to look at the national data on that, and oftentimes they do control for SES. We did control for SES in this model, and SES did not predict. And 60% is not as high as you'd think. Some of the samples upwards that was even presented in this conference were 80-90% SES. So in this sample, we still had some middle, one of the middle schools of the 5 was middle to upper class, and we did not find any difference in the reports of teen dating violence in the middle school, in the high school, where those kids came from middle to upper class. Again, it is very challenging to get affluent communities to do these types of studies. And so, yes, we most certainly need to control for that. And we have in some of our papers as well, where we still found these associations, and SES didn't interact, it didn't moderate. So I think, yeah, we want to be very, very careful that this isn't, just certainly stress, parental stress, and can contribute to alcohol and drug use, which heightens the risk of exposure to domestic violence. But I don't think we want to, you're right, there's lots of things happening in higher SES families that just doesn't come to the attention because they're not likely to have researchers come in. Where I've tried to go into those communities, I've been run off very, very quickly because no one really wants for their children to report on certain types of things and thinking about teen dating violence and other things.
Great, thank you. Yeah. And you also, in the model, maybe we should bring the model back up on the screen. There are a couple questions that came through about that in terms of, you had mentioned that cigarettes and alcohol are identified in the model, but some folks were wondering if illicit drugs were also part of the equation.
Yeah, so we used a comprehensive, so we did both lifetime and last 30 days, and in this particular sample, there was quite a bit of alcohol, marijuana, and cigarette smoking, but in mostly the form of an e-cigarette, you should know, but there was very little use of illicit drugs. Now, you could argue that the kids that might have been involved in illicit drugs, they're not in the high school, right? And so, but there's very small percentage that was, when we asked about crack or cocaine, that they were using those. Heavy marijuana users, though, in the sample.
Thank you. We have a lot of great questions coming in. Please do keep on submitting your questions, and since we are doing a series, hopefully we can start to address some of these questions in future webinars on bullying and prevention. I'd like to move the next few questions over to talk about interventions a little bit. Mm-hmm. So several people have remarked on the sibling aggression and how tightly it fits in with this model and how consistent it is across the board. They were wondering if there are any interventions that specifically address sibling aggression.
In the area of bullying or just in general?
I think in general, but probably as it relates to bullying as well.
Yeah, so if many of you have probably watched the videos of the Institute of Medicine workshop, and Melissa Holt presented on family-based interventions, and she essentially started her talk by saying, for specifically in bullying, family-based school-based interventions, whether it's sibling or otherwise, other family members, there's essentially no attention to that. However, there have been a lot of community and family-based interventions that target at-risk youth that have high aggression, but those kids tend to be what we would say is reactively aggressive with hostile attributions, right? So Deb Gorman-Smith and Patrick Tolan have done some of these studies, and they find very, very small effect sizes and sometimes no reduction. So in the area of bullying, no, most of the bullying work that we've done has been school-based. It's been positive behavior support. It's been social-emotional learning. It's not touched family violence. Now, what is an interesting question, though, is, and I'll flip it for the folks, the participants, is, okay, if we have an SEL-based program where kids are learning to regulate their emotions and anger and communicate, do we have an impact on that family system? And I'll tell you, when I do these trials, at the end of our last trial, middle school trial in Southside Chicago, we were doing a focus groups and interviews, my team was, asking them about what they remembered about these 41 lessons they had over 3 years. And some of these kids said, like, I learned to belly breathe, and I learned to count, and I learned to kind of slow down, and I learned how to, get out of a situation so it doesn't escalate. And they said, but I can't really use those skills on the street, but I have been able to use it with my siblings. And so for us, in the current trial we're doing, we really would like to look at the extent to which are these school-based programs actually impacting that system. And when I have parents calling me and saying, what are you teaching my kids? Like, they're teaching me things. What are you teaching them? And if a kid goes home and says, hey, Mom, have you thought about just belly breathing? This is what we did in school. Or have you thought about counting? And so I don't know if it has to be like targeting the sibling aggression, but can we as researchers allow ourselves to say, how do our school-based interventions impact the larger community, including family? And that's where I think we need to mine some of these data that we have to say, do we have an impact? If we believe that all the systems interact, right? So if you look at this conceptual model, if in fact I'm reducing bullying, that connection with sibling aggression, because it's so, there should be an impact there. And maybe I'm just optimistic, but I think, to get back to the question, there's not enough out there. But we do have family-based prevention programs for other forms of aggression, but they tend to be highly aggressive youth. So it's a great question. And, I think about how difficult it is to do the school-based work, especially in U.S. populations where the teachers are testing. My kids in Chicago Public Schools have been testing for 3 weeks. Our SEL program's been shut down, right? So, how can we have alternative ways of reaching kids? And one thing I'd throw out there is that Michelle Ybarra and I just developed a text messaging program that we only needed 40 minutes of the school's time, and then we enrolled the kids in a 7.5-week text messaging program where they learn everything they would in a canned curriculum in the classroom, but they have it in real time. They have it on their phone. And I would like to think that that would impact the systems as well.
Great, thank you. I think your answer really relates to several other questions that we've been getting in about breaking silos. People wanted you to talk a little bit more about that, but I think the response you gave there is, we need to be working on the culture of respect. We need to be doing these programs that are a little bit more behavior-based and reach across all of these different forms of violence and are more about what's happening in the classroom, what's happening in the family, et cetera, so that it does break those silos. And there was a question as well about whether or not these interventions need to be gender specific.
Yeah, I don't necessarily, so anecdotally we know that some of the programming that we use, girls may resonate more with it, right? There's dyadic, there's group exchanges, we talk about our feelings. And certainly, Dr. Liz Miller is doing some really good work with coaching boys into men, and that would argue for a kind of a tailored approach for the ways in which boys talk to one another and how they refer to girls. So I think that there is some suggestion that we may have these universal kind of risk and protective factors that need to be considered, but there might have to be some gender tailoring. And then we haven't answered the question of, are we creating programs where, girls and boys might resonate with this. At the same time, like we're trying to move away from just talking about gender in that kind of dichotomy, right, because it's not. And what's intriguing about that, and it's not really not answering that question, but if you talk to kids now, and we're doing quite a bit of work in the middle schools, if you talk to these kids, they don't necessarily just see it as just boys and girls, right? So there's more of a gender expression. It's the adults that kind of see everything as, well, girls are going to resonate with this, boys won't. But I think we have to think about delivery. I think we have to think about developmental timing. One example at this conference, they were talking about how only girls gossip. Well, boys gossip, they just don't call it gossiping. And so just generally, we've got to get away from boys are this and girls are this, and then think of more around gender expression. And because you can have, boys that love to get in dietic and groups and talk. And so we need to be able to, an intervention, this has been my big soapbox here for a while, is that we need to allow ourselves to open the black box of these interventions and say, who are they working for, under what conditions, what level of implementation. We haven't done that. We focus on, did it work or did it not work? Well, didn't we know 2 decades ago? We've always said, what does it work for whom, under what conditions? And we need to allow ourselves to do that and to say it doesn't work here, works better here. And I think gender needs to be part of that. The school climate needs to be part of it, teacher training. All of that needs to be part of thinking about, how do our interventions work? What are the mechanisms? Open the black box. Right? We know that the leading bullying prevention program in Finland, they opened the black box and they found that it was working because teachers changed their behaviors in the classroom to the point where kids were more supportive and there were fewer victims. Well, if you're just focusing on did it work, it doesn't answer the question of why did it work.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And we did have a couple questions about same-sex issues as well as teen dating violence, whether it went just males to females or females to male. And I thought that was a really interesting design, the way that you designed the study and the waves of data that came through, where it seemed like it was open enough to address teen dating violence and these experiences, no matter what direction they're going in or what the couple relationship looks like. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, so this is just based on the demographics. We have a very small percentage of kids that identify as homosexual or bi. We do have a few. We have enough that we can look at these models separately for them, but not enough. And given the large African American sample, it's not a surprise that they weren't necessarily willing to come out on a survey to us. So that's why we were very thoughtful about the STEM that we used around dating, so that if I am in a same-sex relationship, I can still report upon it. And so that was a great point that you saw that. Much more work needs to be done in this area. I know that National Institute of Justice are committed to understanding what violence looks like within same-sex. I know NIH is funding some folks to do this and thinking about this. And I know that now in our national data sets, we're actually measuring sexual orientation. So for the longest time, we haven't been able to answer this question because our federal government hasn't been tracking it. So I think we're going to see a lot more. I think with same-sex relationships, I think ethically we owe it to the kids to have their relationship reflected in the work that we do. And so it's a major limitation, and it's one that I'm very cognizant of, and I'm very aware that the dynamics in these same-sex adolescent relationships are important to understand, given that, kids that identify LGBT in our schools, if the school climate is a toxic one, their risk is quite elevated for these types of violent experiences.
Great, thank you very much. We just have 2 minutes left in today's webinar, so I wanted to point out that the next webinar in this series is entitled Bullying Gets Under Your Skin, Effects of Bullying on Children and Youth, and it will take place on April 27th from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll have the registration and additional information coming out soon. We also have a brief evaluation that I would like you to complete. We would love to hear your thoughts on today's presentation as well as upcoming webinars, and we're constantly looking to improve our system and our experiences with the audiences. I do want to be respectful of your time, and thank you very much, Dorothy Espelage, for your presentation today. There's clearly a lot more that we can learn on this topic, but it sounds like we have a wonderful model that's really working and pushing this field forward. So thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Everyone have a good day.
Thank you. And with that, we'll conclude the webinar. We hope to see you soon.
The meeting is now over. All the participants have been disconnected.